In 1892, a scholar and British Egyptologist named Walter Ewing Crum thought he had Egyptian Christian literature figured out. Monasteries made the books. Monks read the books. End of story. But then, over the following decades, something started going wrong with that picture. Manichaean texts surfaced. Coptic Gnostic manuscripts emerged from the sands, and suddenly, everything scholars thought they knew about who was writing, copying and reading in ancient Egypt was up for debate. Then came 1945. A farmer in the Egyptian desert, digging for fertilizer, struck something hard beneath the soil. What he pulled out of the ground that day would detonate like a bomb inside the world of biblical scholarship, ancient leather-bound books sealed in a clay jar, untouched for over 1,500 years. Nobody agreed on where they came from. And that argument is still raging today. In 1995, a Russian scholar named Alexander Khosroyev threw down a challenge that nobody has fully answered since. His argument was simple and devastating. These texts are too strange, too philosophical, too openly hostile to the Bible for any self-respecting Pachomian monk to have owned them. The men of these monasteries swore their lives to Orthodox scripture and the Church Fathers. So who, exactly, were these books written for? Instead, Khosroyev proposed a different origin entirely, a framework built around a syncretistic mentality, attributing the library to Greco-Egyptian urban intellectuals who saw themselves as esoteric, non-traditional Christians operating well outside the institutional church. Alistair Logan took a different approach. He argued that the collection belonged to an ascetic, Sethian Gnostic community, a group that originally formed in an urban setting before moving to the Chernoboskia region in the late 4th century to escape escalating ecclesiastical persecution. Logan identified a core scriptural nucleus within Codices RV and 8, suggesting the community read the entire collection through a strict Sethian mythological lens, one dominated by the cosmic descent of Barbelo and a highly ritualized 5 seals baptism. The physical location where the codices were found, at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs, has always been central to the debate. Jean Dorès initially interpreted this site in 1950 as a pharaonic-era cemetery, implying the books were buried in pagan ground far from any monastic centre. But more recent topographical analysis has shown that the find site was actually just 6 to 8 kilometres from the major Pachomian headquarters at Perbo and the monastery at Shenset. Beyond that, archaeological surveys have confirmed that local monks actively used these cliffside tomb caves as hermitages and burial sites, and they left their mark. Red-painted psalm incipits and monastic graffiti still visible on the ancient rock walls. Dating the collection depends heavily on the study of cartonnage, the recycled papyrus used to stiffen the leather covers. This analysis establishes a terminus post-chem of 348 CE for Codex 7 and points to mid to late 4th century production for Codex V, based on references to the economic inflation of the period. The 1945 discovery itself centres on Muhammad Ali al-Saman, a peasant from Hamra Doum, who stumbled upon a sealed earthenware jar while digging for nitrate-rich fertilizer in the desert. Al-Saman's own account captures something deeply human about the moment. He overcame his initial fear that a jinni occupied the vessel and smashed it open, hoping to find hidden gold inside. What he found instead were ancient codices, which he carried back to his courtyard, where his mother, not recognizing what they were, burned portions of the priceless papyrus as fuel for a fire. James Robinson's investigations in the 1970s attempted to establish a coherent modern history of the discovery, but his account drew sharp criticism from scholars who saw it as riddled with Orientalist tropes. These critics argue that such discovery narratives deploy caricatures of irrational peasantry to retroactively justify the transfer of these textual artifacts into Western academic institutions. That said, later defences point to a 1987 filmed record in which Al-Saman himself corroborated the core details of the story. The excavation, his fear of spirits, and the clan violence that briefly delayed the manuscripts from reaching the antiquities market. The problem of backdoor Orientalism runs even deeper in Nag Hammadi scholarship, showing up in the persistent romanticization of Gnosticism as a suppressed, inherently progressive form of early Christianity. A move that projects modern Western egalitarian values onto late antique ascetics. This same historiographical impulse mirrors the 19th century fascination with Eastern mysticism, strategically recasting the Codices as a pristine heretic's Bible, carrying esoteric wisdom that stood in opposition to a tamed, institutional Orthodox Church. The ethical dimension of all this cannot be ignored. The ongoing Western appetite for unprovenanced antiquities directly fuels the illicit excavation and destructive fragmentation of archaeological heritage, a problem that continues to shadow the legacy of these manuscripts. In the end, while the exact location of the original dig may never be archaeologically verified, the Jabal al-Tarif region remains the definitive geographical anchor for understanding where this collection was found. The Dishna Plain, a landscape defined by the Nile on one side and the imposing Jabal al-Tarif cliffs on the other, forms the primary geographical and social context for early Egyptian Cenobitic and Anchoritic monasticism. The question of where the Nag Hammadi Codices truly belong, their historical sits, im Leben, remains fiercely debated between two camps. The monastic origin hypothesis, which places them within the 4th century Pachomian movement, and the urban Gnostic hypothesis, which assigns them to a cosmopolitan, syncretistic intelligentsia. The Pachomian koinonia was formally established around 323 CE at Tübingen, before rapidly centralizing at Pbo. By 368 CE, it had grown into a major administrative federation comprising 12 monasteries and 3 nunneries, bringing independent houses like Shenneset and Thermutians into its orbit. Running alongside this Cenobitic network were Anchoritic outside monks who pursued extreme ascesis in repurposed cliffside tomb caves, maintaining fragile but real connections to the Cenobitic centres through shared liturgy and local trade. Literary sources support the picture of a massive monastic presence. Both Palladius and the Historia Monachorum in Egypto describe a monastic population approaching 7,000 men, systematically engaged in organised crafts, including weaving, tailoring, and manuscript calligraphy. The archaeological record confirms all of this at the very spot where the codices were found. Cave T8 preserve red-painted Sahidic psalm incipits, used as memory aids for recitation, while Cave T65 contains graffiti of John the Shoemaker depicted in prayer. The evidence from Pibao is equally striking. Excavations at the 4th century basilica, their turned-up late antique ceramics chemically identical to the jar used to seal the codices, and the nearby Bodmer papyri reveal a high-status monastic library that shares the same distinctive codicological features as the Nag Hammadi texts, particularly their tall, narrow, single-column format. The fact that the codices were exhumed from a nitrate-rich fertilizer pit is precisely what makes the provenance controversy so persistent. It fundamentally complicates any attempt to assign these texts a clean origin. The controversy was sharpened by Alexandra Khosroyev, who insisted that the semi-philosophical and anti-biblical character of the texts made Pachomian ownership impossible. His alternative: the codices were a commercial product manufactured by professional booksellers for a cosmopolitan urban clientele. Hugo Lundhaug and Lance Jenott have pushed back powerfully against this view, applying the framework of new philology to the problem. Rather than treating the manuscripts as static texts, they analyze them as dynamic, evolving artifacts, the organic product of a diverse monastic community of practice. The cartonnage embedded within the codices' leather bindings offers some of the most compelling evidence. The recycled papyrus used as structural stiffening contains administrative costofondance, including letters from the priest Sansnose, alongside records of grain shipments to local monasteries. Most significantly, fragment C6 preserves a Coptic letter addressed from an administrator named Papnut to Father Pachomi, a detail that suggests these codices were actively circulating within Pachomian book exchange networks for spiritual and intellectual use. The broader theological climate of the region was anything but stable. Profound monastic diversity, combined with escalating ecclesiastical conflict over extra-canonical literature, culminated in systematic purges led by Archbishop Dioscorus and Jenott of Atrip against perceived heretics, including the Origenist monk Elijah. Despite those intense purges, Pachomian mandates required universal literacy across the Federation. Texts were stored in designated wall niches, shaushed, and securely locked each night by monastic leaders. This was a community that took its books seriously. The presence of textual duplicates and triplicates in the collection, the Apocryphon of John being the most prominent example, strongly points to pedagogical use. These copies supported rigorous exercises in translation, manuscript copying, and comparative theological analysis. The modern label Gnosticism operates more like a marketing category than a historical description. As a historiographical construct, it obscures the complex reality of how the Nag Hammadi Codices were actually produced and used. The dominant Sethian Gnostic hypothesis envisions the collection as the proprietary library of a reclusive cult that migrated to the Chernoboskia region, reading everything through a mythological lens centered on Barbelo and a ritualized five seals baptism. But structural analysis reveals a significant problem with this view. Characteristic Sethian figures are entirely absent from 60% of the treatises, and the prominent placement of the Apocryphon of John across multiple codices points to broad pedagogical popularity, not rigid sectarian identity. Heresiological testimony from Epiphanius complicates the picture further. Individuals labelled as archontics and Gnostics were not members of discrete sociological sects. They were embedded within the Orthodox Church itself, as illustrated by Peter of Kephar Baricha, an anchorite presbyter with an eclectic, non-sectarian library. What's more, 4th and 5th century Egyptian polemicists, including Athanasius and Jenott, spent considerable energy targeting the Melicians and Origenists for circulating apocryphal literature. They never conspicuously directed their condemnation toward any organized Gnostic sect. The transition from localized, temple-bound religious practice to a universalized anywhere religion in late antiquity was, in a very real sense, enabled by the physical codex. This portable medium supported the Christian project of the Epimelia Hotu, the care of the self, transforming inward philosophical reflection into an intimate, textual discipline. The bound book made piety portable and private, effectively replacing the public spectacle of blood sacrifice with the quiet, internalized sacrifice of the written word. New Christian reading methodologies, requiring rapid navigation between disparate passages for comparative study and hermeneutical problem-solving, also made the traditional linear scroll functionally obsolete. Under the lens of new philology, or material philology, these manuscripts are no longer treated as corrupted copies of lost ideals. Instead, they are valued as unique snapshots of living, fluid textual traditions. This approach dismantles the false divide between supposedly artless Christian Kleinliteratur and elite Greco-Roman Hochliteratur, placing early Christian book culture firmly within classical scribal networks. The urban literati hypothesis, as articulated by Khosroyev, rests on the claim that the anti-biblical and semi-philosophical nature of these texts is irreconcilable with a monastic mentality. But the actual mechanics of the texts dismantle this logic. They exhibit deep scriptural engagement and function structurally as interpretive supplements to the Bible, not replacements for it. The characterization of the entire collection as a unified heretics Bible is a modern historiographical trope that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Less than half of the texts actually contain a markedly negative portrayal of the demiurge or the material world. In fact, at least 10 texts within the library express a clearly positive theological view of the Creator, while several others portray the physical cosmos as a direct and harmonious reflection of the divine order. Furthermore, describing the texts as semi-philosophical, and therefore foreign to ascetic life, fails to account for the actual intellectual profile of Egyptian monks. These were not illiterate peasants. Figures like Diocles were active participants in the classical tradition of paideia, deeply engaged with Greek philosophy. And finally on this point, the fact that these manuscripts were translated into Coptic strongly implies a Coptophone monastic readership. A cosmopolitan Greco-Egyptian elite would have engaged with complex philosophical treatises in Greek, not Coptic. A persistent current of backdoor Orientalism runs through Nag Hammadi scholarship, romanticizing the ancient Gnostics as early pioneers of gender equality and modern egalitarianism, projecting contemporary Western ideological desires onto late antique ascetic sources. This mirrors the 19th century Western reception of Eastern traditions, which framed Gnostic literature as a repository of pristine mystical wisdom, standing in opposition to a domesticated, institutionalized Orthodox Church. In historical reality, these texts are better understood as fragments of failed religious experiments, systematically repurposed and recycled by dedicated monastic readers pursuing spiritual rest, or anaparsis, alongside practical tools for spiritual warfare. The existence of textual duplicates within the collection served explicitly pedagogical purposes within a defined textual community, supplying materials for translation exercises, the memorization of gnomic maxims, and the complex negotiation of theological identity in a fraught post-Nicene climate. John W.B. Barnes was the first to argue for a monastic origin based on fragmentary correspondence discovered in the recycled papyrus cartonnage of the leather bindings, specifically identifying letters mentioning Sonsnose the monk, and a Coptic communication addressed to Father Pachomian. John C. Shelton countered with a secular origin theory. He interpreted the large financial figures and references to administrative districts in the cartonnage of Codex Phi as evidence of a government bureaucracy source, perhaps nothing more than an urban rubbish heap. But the economics of the period undermined Shelton's reading. Massive inflation made those seemingly large sums entirely mundane, and official documents frequently ended up in private family archives before being donated to monasteries by new members, exactly as Petronius's father, Pschenthbo, did upon entering the koinonia. Physically, the recycled Genesis fragments found in the cover of Codex 7 match the same tall, narrow single-column format, Turner's Type 8, that defines the entire Nag Hammadi collection, strongly suggesting a shared scribal environment. Codex I stands apart from the rest of the collection as the only multi-choir manuscript assembled irregularly from 3 separate choirs containing 22, 8 and 6 individual sheets. The mechanical construction betrays an impulsive hand. While the first choir uses standard joints, the subsequent smaller choirs feature columata, papyrus overlaps, that are turned right to left, suggesting either a loss of scribal coordination or an accidental reversal during the cutting phase. The primary copyist, designated Scribe A, demonstrates wildly uneven information density throughout. Character counts swing between 600 and 900 letters per page, with severe variations in line length. This kind of textual asymmetry strongly points to an inexperienced or mentally distracted monastic scribe, someone who prioritized internal spiritual reflection over the disciplined, standardized metrics of professional calligraphy. Marginal markings in the manuscript, specifically dipli and coronis signs, offer compelling physical evidence of active monastic study. In the tripartite tractate, Scribe A embedded rows of dipli in the left margin to flag key theological claims about the logos, contemplative prayer, and the mechanics of angelic warfare. Similarly, in Codex 8, lateral strokes and corone are deployed to highlight passages on the differences among souls, the salvific power of self-knowledge, and the ascetic necessity of embracing suffering as an imitatio Christi. These careful physical annotations reveal the internal pedagogical mechanics of a dedicated textual community. How spiritually advanced ascetics used these complex treatises as tactical tools in the ongoing practice of spiritual warfare. Scribal colophons offer some of the most direct evidence for a Christian monastic provenance. The colophon of Codex 7 uses fatherhood, mentiot, as a standard Coptic designation for a monastic superior or abbot. Codex 2's subscript title for the Book of Thomas describes the writer as an athlete, addressing the perfect, holy, and spiritual ones. All technical self-designations used by Anchoritic and Cenobitic ascetics. In Codex 3, the scribe takes on a dual identity, gongessos in the flesh and eudnostos in the spirit, a practice of spiritual renaming that mirrors exactly what we find described in the letters of Antony and Ammonus. The internal mechanics of monastic secrecy are vividly on display in the collection's cryptographic systems. Codex 8 features a sophisticated numerological cryptogram that has been decoded as the Oracles of Truth of Zostrianos. Codex 7 preserves a hidden coded note embedded between treatises, using the Eichphies acrostic alongside specific Pachomian code letters, where Phi signifies light, Eta denotes resurrection, and Tau Upsilon represents the crucified Son. And a personal scribal notation in Codex 6 reveals the inner workings of a private monastic book exchange network. An apology for transmitting unsolicited hermetic texts, with the unspoken acknowledgement of the very real risks posed by ecclesiastical censorship in post-Nicene Egypt. The tension between strict ecclesiastical prohibition and active monastic engagement with apocryphal texts is perfectly captured by the defense attributed to Pseudo-Evodius of Rome, who justified these texts as homiletic aids, tools to illuminate scriptural ambiguities and clothe the garment with gold without displacing the established canon. This logic closely parallels Priscillian of Avila's argument that extra-canonical traditions serve the spiritually mature, demanding a discerning reading that empowers the perfect to extract genuine theological value from even corrupt or heterodox material. Archaeological evidence recovered from both the monastery of Macarius at Scetis and the White Monastery confirms the long survival of sensational apocryphal literature in monastic settings, including the investiture of St. Michael, which invokes the demonic entity Saklataborth, and the Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles, featuring the enigmatic Lithargoel operating as a physician carrying a spiritual medicine chest. To control these potent materials, internal monastic rules required all books to be stored in designated wall niches, Schaust or fenestra, which were counted and physically locked every night by the designated house second to prevent unauthorized circulation. Pachomian hagiographies record a decisive intervention when Theodore mandated the Coptic translation of Athanasius' 39th festal letter as binding law, a critical move to systematically purge heretical volumes that had previously misled local monks. At Jenott's White Monastery, textual control was even more centralized, with the elder enforcing monthly cell searches of every niche and vessel to confiscate any volumes that exceeded the permitted limit or raised doctrinal concerns. The monastic canons explicitly prohibited monks from engaging in unauthorized bookmaking or selling manuscripts to people of the world, reserving all textual production for the scriptorium under direct paternal supervision. This already intense environment of censorship was further inflamed when Archbishop Dioscorus directly linked apocryphal literature to the Origenist pestilence, commanding local bishops to confiscate heretical books and formally anathematize those who possessed them. The 7 canonical Coptic vowels, a, I-E, ow, u, o, and u, function within texts like the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit as complex oral mind maps, engineered to give initiates a direct acoustic link to the praises of the heavenly host, often grouped under the secretive ritual of the 5 seals. What's visually striking is that these vowel strings are not rubricated or highlighted in the Nag Hammadi Codices, unlike what we find in standard magical texts. This suggests they were internal study material for advanced monastics, not performance cues in a ritual manual. The treatise, Marsanes, takes this phonetic architecture further, correlating specific spherical shapes with soul configurations and asserting that the mind can traverse cosmic spheres and separate the soul from demonic angels, only through precise knowledge of hierarchical consonant and vowel sounds, categorized as oxytones, semivowels, or voiceless. The trimorphic protonoia develops this further still, using the visual metaphor of 3 squares, or quadrangles residing secretly in the silence of the ineffable one, possibly encoding sophisticated Pythagorean proofs of irrational numbers as symbols of divine infinity embedded directly into cosmic structure. The Pachomian monastic system made active use of a cryptic spiritual alphabet and secret, unspoken spiritual languages as essential tools to help initiates transcend exterior reality and align themselves with heavenly praises, while simultaneously repelling desert demons. The physical codex itself was understood as a protective artifact through the systematic use of nomina sacra, particularly the abbreviation of pneuma. The manuscript was imbued with active spiritual agency. Visual elements in codex. I make this protective function explicit. A Christogram flyleaf reading Gul, Gul, Christ is holy, and a deliberately enlarged rendering of the Coptic letter T, which served as both an aesthetic and apotropaic surrogate for the Latin cross. This logic was in service of a broader goal, cultivating apatheia, or immovability, deploying the cross as a spiritual weapon against demonic trickery and securing the ultimate monastic goal of rest, or dukkha. Ultimately, this performative ontology transformed the material book into an active, conscious agent of warfare, shielding the monastic practitioner from the world rulers of this aeon that populated the hostile Egyptian desert landscape. The codicological architecture of the Nag Hammadi collection is defined by a fundamental tension. On one hand, clearly distinct typological subgroups, on the other, a remarkable overarching scribal consistency. James Robinson identified 3 primary groupings based on the mechanical construction of the leather covers, placing most manuscripts into groups 1, 2, and 3, with Codex 3 standing apart as a typological outlier. Michael Williams' paleographical analysis produced a different and non-congruent schema, identifying scribal groups A, B, and C based on individual handwriting, groupings that don't align with Robinson's structural divisions. These discrepancies suggest either the integration of originally independent subcollections or production across different monastic workshops. Yet the universal adherence to type 8 dimensions and single-column formats signals a unified, sophisticated scribal culture underlying it all. The production of the codices was not an industrialized operation. It was driven by small collaborative networks, evidenced by the brief 8-line intervention of Scribe J within the larger text of Codex 2. This decentralized model is reinforced by the overlapping contributions of scribes A, B, and C across codices I, 7, and 11, a fluid, cooperative scribal environment where multiple hands shaped a single volume. The pervasive dialectal mixture within the collection has generated 2 competing explanations. The traveller aspect, in which texts accumulated linguistic variants through private exchange networks, or a socio-linguistic model driven by the migration of monks from diverse backgrounds into cenobitic hubs like Pibao. Materially, the Nag Hammadi Codices closely mirror high-status contemporary biblical manuscripts like the Shoyan Gospel of Matthew, sharing nearly identical layouts, subscript titles, and sophisticated correction techniques. The strategic presence of duplicate and triplicate versions within the collection, including multiple copies of the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Truth, and On the Origin of the World, constitute strong evidence of monastic pedagogical utility, far exceeding what independent, unrelated origins could explain. Within large monastic communities, these textual redundancies made simultaneous group study possible and provided essential comparative material for advanced scribal training in linguistic translation and classical rhetoric. Specific editorial decisions reveal the mechanics at work. In The Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, the Codex III version preserves twice the Greek terminology found in Codex IV, which instead uses Coptic equivalents. This divergence indicates a deliberate translation policy calibrated for pedagogical purpose. The Greek-heavy version served advanced scholars, while the Coptic version facilitated broader comprehension across the wider monastic community. The Apocryphon of John further illustrates this textual spectrum. The two long versions in Codices II and IV are virtually identical in content, but they exhibit systematic dialectal shifts between Subic mimicisms and standard Sahidic. The longer recensions also integrate dense list-based excerpts, such as the Book of Zoroaster, high-density material designed specifically for rigorous manuscript copying and memorization exercises. Textual fluidity in the Nag Hammadi Codices enabled what can only be described as strategic theological fine-tuning, carefully calibrated to navigate the shifting ecclesiastical pressures of the post-Nicene era. Geoffrey Smith argues that the fragmented version of the Gospel of Truth in Codex 12 functions as an anti-originist redaction of the longer, deterministic Codex I version, rephrasing metaphors of ointment-filled jars specifically to sidestep contentious debates about predestination and human free will. The transformation of Eugnostos the Blessed, native Egyptian imagery, into the explicitly Christian framework of the wisdom of Jesus Christ in Codex IV demonstrates the mechanics of editorial Christianizing, designed to bridge established Ptolemaic traditions with the ascendant Cenobitic movement. These sophisticated textual maneuvers were reserved for a defined spiritual elite, the perfect, or spiritually mature monks, whose discernment allowed them to safely navigate advanced material, while the broader community engaged with the standard biblical and patristic texts found in the Dishna papers. The monastic landscape of the Dishna plain in the 4th and 5th centuries provides the primary socio-historical framework for understanding who owned and curated the Nag Hammadi Codices. This was a world defined by ascetic diversity, encompassing established Pachomian Cenobites, schismatic Meletians, and intellectually rigorous, originist-leaning monks, all living and working in close proximity. The Pachomian Federation, known as the Tabernasiots, had achieved regional dominance through a network of over 9 male and female communities, fully operational by 347 CE. The Meletian origin hypothesis argues that the collection belonged to the schismatic Meletian Church, a theory grounded primarily in Archbishop Athanasius' 39th festal letter, which explicitly condemned that group for using fabricated apocrypha. Empirical support for this hypothesis comes from the cartonnage of Codex VII and the mention of the monk Sansnos, whose unusual dual status as both a monk and an ordained priest aligns with documentary evidence from Meletian archives. Archives from Hathor and Labla in Middle Egypt confirm a distinct Meletian social structure in which ordained monastics engaged in commercial transactions, mirroring the administrative and priestly roles attributed to Sansnos. However, the presence of the Father Pachomi letter in the same cartonnage, designated fragment C6, creates a critical tension, pointing instead toward a direct administrative and spiritual connection to the Pachomian Federation's founder. The Origenist origin hypothesis approaches the question from another angle, highlighting the pervasive influence of Origen's speculative theology in early Egyptian monasticism, a legacy exemplified by figures like Saint Anthony, which remained doctrinally integrated well into the late 4th century. Heresiologists like Epiphanius, and later polemicists like Jenott and Dioscorus, explicitly associated Origenist-leaning monks with the illicit possession of apocryphal volumes describing other worlds and cosmological mysteries not found in canonical scripture. Nag Hammadi treatises like the Teachings of Sylvanus and the Gospel of Philip reflect these Origenist preoccupations directly, particularly around the metaphysical concepts of the pre-existence of the soul and its fall from the divine pleroma. These same texts articulate a doctrine of spiritual resurrection within a pneumatic body, using complex allegorical exegesis to transform the material experience into a map for navigating the transcendent realm. Bishop Ammon's letter from the 350s documents significant doctrinal diversity within the Pachomian Federation itself, specifically noting the monk Pachelphius's controversial teachings on a non-material spiritual resurrection. 5th century hagiographers later tried to bring the Federation's founder into alignment with Alexandrian orthodoxies by inserting anachronistic anecdotes, including the story of Pachomius detecting the moral stench of Origen's doctrines and destroying his volumes to protect the community. The institutional stability of the Federation was further challenged by internal schisms, most notably the secession of the monastery at Thessaloniki under Appa Apollonios, in a direct rejection of centralized authority. These tensions eventually forced a systemic house-cleaning under Theodore, who strictly enforced Athanasius's 367 CE decree to eradicate all apocryphal literature from monastic libraries and re-establish doctrinal uniformity. Monastic book culture rested on a foundation of mandated literacy. According to Pachomian rules 139 and 140, even illiterate neophytes were required to undergo systematic instruction until they reached full textual competency. Communal textual practice was centered on nocturnal assemblies where monastics engaged with crypta, the hidden things, and enigmatic spiritual sayings, reflecting on the esoteric exegesis provided by their housemasters. This pedagogical environment made the Nag Hammadi Codices a vital interpretive supplement to the biblical canon, material curated specifically for the teleos, the spiritually mature monks capable of navigating advanced theological terrain. The appeal of these texts to monastic audiences is partly explained by specific theological and visual resonances. The technical designation spiritual resurrection, ta anastasis en pneumatique, appears verbatim in both the treatise on the resurrection and the life of Pachomius, a striking verbal overlap. Visual metaphors depicting Adam and Eve as luminous, celibate figures offered a powerful ascetic archetype, representing the recovery of primordial radiance through dedicated ascesis, the exhaustive demonologies in the Apocryphon of John, and on the origin of the world, cataloguing the names, ranks, and functions of evil spirits, functioned as tactical manuals for the spiritual combat that lay at the heart of desert monastic life. These texts gave monks granular detail on the bodily manifestations of hostile entities, empowering them to identify and repel the specific spirits of deception that haunted the desert during solitary contemplation. The ascetic ideal of apatheia, immovability, was carefully cultivated as a psychological fortress against salos, the demonic tossing or turbulence of the passions that threatened the monk's internal stability. Narratives of heavenly ascent in Nag Hammadi texts, attributed to figures like James, Peter, Paul, and Shem, functioned as literary mirrors to the visionary topoi found in ascetic legends of Onofrius and Pachomius, validating the monk's own quest for celestial passage. Within the Gospel of Thomas and the Dialogue of the Saviour, the term monachos, monk, is applied directly to the reader, identifying them as the elect bridal chamber initiate, a technical metaphor for a soul that has achieved perfect celibate unity with the divine. This self-referencing logic transformed the collection into a specialized spiritual mirror for the holy ones who sought to transcend the material world and secure their place among the spiritual elite of the desert. The Nag Hammadi Codices functioned as sophisticated instruments within a defined textual community, where monastic leaders strategically used these manuscripts for social regulation, the maintenance of hierarchical authority, and the forging of a shared collective identity. Within this community of practice, the production and active reading of the NHC supported specific spiritual trajectories, guiding individuals as they developed the discernment necessary to navigate the complexities of late antique ascetic life. Structurally, the evidence points to a stratified library system. While the general monastic population engaged with the foundational biblical and patristic texts found in the Dishna papers, the NHC constituted a restricted specialized archive reserved for the spiritually mature. This hierarchical restriction was also a protective mechanism, ensuring that hazardous subjects such as demiurgical theologies and dangerous spiritual ventures were handled only by those who possessed the requisite spiritual status to engage with them safely. The Nag Hammadi Codices also served to reinforce monastic individualism, providing a clandestine intellectual space for monks to cultivate a private sense of identity within a social framework where behavior was otherwise tightly communal and regulated. Physical evidence from Codex, its impulsive choir assembly and fluctuating scribal quality, strongly suggests this was a bespoke, non-commercial artifact, made specifically for the personal use of its reader-scribe. The meticulous marginal markings in Codices I and VIII reveal a specific pedagogical logic, highlighting the monk's intense engagement with the nature of the Godhead, the transformative power of self-knowledge, and the ascetic imitatio Christi through physical suffering. These annotations represent what we might call the active life of the text, the physical manuscript as a site for negotiating the self, allowing the ascetic to find personal resonance within the complex, often paradoxical frameworks of late antique mysticism. The magical vowel constellations in the NHC functioned as internal mind maps or contemplative reference materials rather than active ritual manuals. Their absence of the rubrication or highlighting typical of dedicated magical papyri suggests a more meditative or pedagogical use. These oral features resonated deeply with the Pachomian goal of transcending the shadow of the exterior world, using sound and frequency as a ladder to move beyond material perception toward direct divine reality. The consistent and systematic application of nomina sacra throughout the collection is physical proof that these scribes belonged to unified scribal networks, adhering to standardized sacred protocols even across manuscripts produced in separate monasteries. The pedagogical logic of duclete versions, such as the multiple copies of the Apocryphon of John, enabled simultaneous study within large monastic communities and supplied comparative material for advanced training in translation and the study of gnomic maxims. These parallel texts also facilitated theological redaction, allowing monks to fine-tune or Christianize older treatises to meet the specific doctrinal challenges and ecclesiastical pressures of the post-Nicene era. The social-historical framework for the Nag Hammadi collection ultimately centers on the Pachomian Federation, a conclusion supported by the geographic proximity of the Jabal al-Tarif discovery site to the major monasteries of Bor and Sheneset. This institutional link is made tangible by the Father Pachomi letter. Fragment C6, discovered in the recycled papyrus cartonnage of Codex 7, establishing a direct administrative connection between this library and the leadership of the Pachomian movement. Monks used these esoteric works as interpretive supplements to the Bible, adopting a hermeneutical stance similar to that of Pseudo-Evodius and Priscillian of Avila, both of whom sanctioned extra-canonical traditions as tools for clarifying scriptural ambiguity. This selective reading approach empowered the perfect teleos to effectively set aside or bypass demiurgical theology, which characterizes less than half the collection, and focus their intellectual energy on the search for primordial unity. The Nag Hammadi library was not a collection of heretical outcasts. It was a sophisticated monastic toolkit designed for those seeking to close the gap between the written word and the lived experience of the divine. The recycled Genesis fragments, designated C2, found in the cartonnage of Codex 7 are incontrovertible evidence that the producers of these codices were intimately engaged with canonical scripture, integrating it into the very material fabric of their specialized library. 5th century Upper Egypt was a world that was fundamentally ideologically interwoven, a landscape where the fragile boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy were constantly being negotiated through the strategic possession, circulation, and censorship of books describing other worlds and celestial mysteries. The Nag Hammadi collection represents a complex, fluid spectrum of Christian opinion and practice, one that resists modern binary paradigms in favour of a sophisticated, multi-layered understanding of late antique religious identity. This nuanced reality reframes the Gnostics not as a separate sect, but as a textual community of monks who sought spiritual rest, anaposis, and tactical tools for warfare by integrating diverse traditions into a singular, resilient ascetic identity. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Codices in 1945 at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs established a definitive physical nexus for this library. Within a few kilometres of the Pachomian Cenobitic headquarters at Pibo and the monastery of Shenset, the physical manuscripts, primarily single-quire papyrus codices, with the unique exception of the multi-quire Codex Y, aid there to Eric Turner's Type 8 dimensions, a standardised tall and narrow format measuring 13-15 by 24 to 30 centimetres. The construction of Codex Y, featuring 3 quires of unequal sheets and reversed papyrus joints, points to an impulsive, non-commercial assembly by an inexperienced monk scribe, who prioritised internal theological reflection over professional calligraphic standards. Despite their varied physical subgroups, the paleographical analysis of scribal groups A, B, and C reveals a high degree of technical consistency, signalling a unified scribal culture that spanned the diverse monasteries of the region. The urban literati hypothesis, which characterises the collection as a heretic's Bible for a syncretistic Greco-Egyptian intelligentsia, is fundamentally undermined by the overwhelming prevalence of Coptic script. The target audience was clearly Coptophone monastics, not a Greek-speaking urban elite. Furthermore, dismissing these texts as anti-biblical ignores the exhaustive scriptural exegesis running throughout the library. The Nag Hammadi Codices functioned as hermeneutical problem-solving supplements, designed to bridge scriptural gaps, not replace the established Bible. Archaeological evidence from cliffside caves T8 and T65, with their red-painted Sahidic psalm incipits and monastic graffiti, provides physical confirmation that monks used the Jabal al-Tarif site for both solitary prayer and ritual burial. Documentary evidence in the cartonnage. The recycled papyrus used to stiffen the leather bindings reveals a mundane administrative reality. Tax accounts and personal letters involving the monk Sonsnose and the administrator Papnut. Most critical to the monastic provenance is fragment C6 from Codex 7, a Coptic letter specifically addressed to Father Pachomi, which establishes an explicit, tangible connection between the Nag Hammadi manuscripts and the founder of the Pachomian Cenobitic koinonia. The marginal markings in Codices 8, specifically the dipli and coronis signs, serve as an archaeological record of active monastic engagement, transforming the manuscript from a static object into a dynamic pedagogical tool. Within the tripartite tractate, NHCI 5, these markings are strategically deployed to flag critical theological claims, the logos as an offspring of wisdom, the efficacy of prayer as an internal turning, the mechanics of angelic warfare, and the complex salvation of the psychic race. These annotations reflect the internal mechanics of an asterisk textual community, where the perfect teleos. Spiritually advanced monks utilized these texts for care of the self and the cultivation of spiritual discernment in a fraught theological landscape. The existence of duplicate and triplicate versions, including the Apocryphon of John, Gospel of Truth, and Eugnostus the Blessed, provided the material infrastructure for simultaneous study across large communities and served as comparative data for advanced training in translation and rhetoric. Redactional shifts, particularly in the Codex 12 version of the Gospel of Truth, demonstrate the library's adaptability. By mitigating deterministic language, these fine-tuned versions likely served as anti-originist corrections, aligning the text with contemporary ecclesiastical pressures. The physical Nag Hammadi Codices functioned as protective artifacts within the framework of spiritual combat, where scribes used asterisk nomina sacra, ast, systematically abbreviated holy names, to imbue the physical papyrus with active spiritual agency against desert demons. In Codex Y, the systematic enlargement of the Coptic letter T served as a hidden apotropaic cross symbol, giving the monk a visual anchor for apatheia or spiritual firmness to resist the destabilizing tossing of demonic passions. The collection's oral and magical features, specifically the vowel constellations A, I, E, Au, U, O, and U, functioned as internal mind maps for advanced contemplation, providing initiates with a sonic link to the rhythmic praises of the heavenly host. These vowels mirrored the spiritual alphabet, found in the letters of Pachomius, intended to help the monk transcend the shadow of the exterior world and arrive at a state of pure, unmediated spiritual perception. The Nag Hammadi library was, in every sense, a specialized monastic toolkit, where the mechanics of the physical book itself, from its dimensions and sacred abbreviations to its hidden symbols, were engineered to guide the monk's journey from material exile toward primordial unity. The presence of Sahidic Genesis fragments, C2, in the cartonnage of Codex 7 provides definitive material evidence that the producers of the Nag Hammadi Codices were deeply engaged in copying and studying canonical scripture, integrating it into the very physical structure of their specialized library. The burial of the codices in a sealed ceramic jar at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif was a deliberate act of preservation, undertaken during the aggressive 5th century purges of heretical books associated with Origenist mysteries and cosmological other worlds. Structurally, the NHC formed a specialized, hierarchical library section reserved for the intellectual elite of the Pachomian Federation. The spiritually mature who possessed the discernment to navigate advanced material, while the broader monastic population relied on the standard biblical and patristic texts represented by the nearby Dishna papers. The collection represents a complex spectrum of Christian practice that rejects modern binary paradigms of heresy versus orthodoxy in favor of an ideologically interwoven monastic culture, one in which the pursuit of divine knowledge, or gnosis, was a central pillar of the ascetic life. This collection stands not as the library of a lost sect, but as a sophisticated monastic toolkit, proof that the textual community of the Egyptian desert was far more intellectually daring and doctrinally fluid than later hagiographers ever dared to admit.